Hello, everybody. Oh, there we go. How are you, Mr. Reel? Welcome to Mormonism Live.
I'm doing great, Mr. Radio Free Mormon. How are you?
I think I'm great. Thank you so much. Today's
Excellent.
date, by the way, is November 13th, 2024. It's Wednesday. It should be 6:20, well, by now 6:21 p.m. Mountain Time, the time every Wednesday when Mormonism Live goes on the air.
Yeah, it's a weekly regular thing that we haven't missed, even on weeks where you on one occasion and me on 3 occasions, I believe, was not present for the show. The show must go on.
Indeed. And it's going on tonight. And tonight it will go on in rare form because we're going to be talking about a doctrine that is very, very important to the Latter-day Saints. And it is the doctrine that Jesus Christ is our elder brother in the Spirit. And to help us talk about this, we have a special guest. And that special guest is here. His name is, drumroll please.
That's
Hello,
my best
Paul.
drum.
Paul, where'd you go? There you are. Hey,
Here I
Paul. It's Paul Toscano, everyone.
Summoned from the depths of hell, here I am.
I'm glad you could get a pass.
It's not always easy, but here I am.
Yes. So we're going to talk a little bit about this because tonight's episode hangs not only on a paper that I wrote and that was published in BYU Studies back in 2006. The title of tonight's show, thank you, is How Did Mormons Make Jesus Our Elder Brother?
Can I just say, RFM, this was a fun thumbnail to put together. You had mentioned a little play off of Leave It to Beaver, except putting Jesus in as Wally. And I had a lot of fun putting this one on, and I hope you enjoy our thumbnails as from time to time, I think they're just top notch. And anyway, great idea, RFM.
I feel like this was one of the better ones. If you'll leave it up there for just a second, I want everybody to know, yes, we get the fact that Wally is the older brother, and Leave It to Jesus is Leave It to Beaver, and Beaver's the little brother. We got it, but we thought it was worth running with it anyway. So,
That's
you know, okay. So we've got this situation where Mormons today, if you go take missionary discussions, what you will be taught is that Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother got together and had a baby, okay? And they had lots of babies. And even though when they get together, Heavenly Father, we know, it's doctrine in the Mormon church today, that Heavenly Father has a body of flesh and bones as tangible as man's. The Son also. And I guess, the idea occurs to me, are we just presuming that Heavenly Mother has a body of flesh and bones as tangible as woman's? I mean, she must, right? She must, right?
Otherwise, all that celestial sex might injure her. She better have a solid frame.
Well, it's hard to get your groove on when one of the parties is a spirit. I'm thinking,
right.
Okay? So by this process, they literally beget children. And those children do not have bodies of flesh and bones. They're just spirits, okay? That's something that's really never explained, I think, in Mormonism, at least not in the missionary discussions. I've never heard a good explanation for that. But nevertheless, that is the case. So they have billions and billions of spirit children because each one corresponds to a person who comes down to this earth to take upon themselves a physical body. Okay. Now, out of these billions and billions of spirit children, there was one that was born first, right? And the firstborn of all of these spirit children, Mormonism today teaches, was Jesus. Or to be more specific, it was that spirit that would come down to earth take the body of Jesus and do the things that we read about Jesus doing in the New Testament. So that is how it is that Mormons believe today that Jesus is the elder brother in the spirit of all mankind. There's nobody who's ever been born on this earth who is older than Jesus, who was born in the spirit before Jesus was born in the spirit. So, having said all that, and hopefully having made that clear for everybody in the audience who may not be a Mormon, may never have been a Mormon, I took it upon myself a number of years ago, let's say 20 years ago. The reason I was interested in this really doesn't matter, but what I became interested in was the idea that Jesus is our elder brother in the spirit, because I had at that time been doing a lot of research in Joseph Smith, his sermons, his statements, his letters. And I had noticed that it did not seem that Joseph Smith ever addressed this particular issue, but I hadn't done a thorough study on the subject. It just sort of seemed that way to me. And it also seemed to me that it really wasn't talked about in the scriptures, any of the standard works. There were certain things or statements or scriptural texts that were used as proof texts to support that idea. When I looked at them a little bit closer, they didn't seem that strong. They didn't really seem to be standing for that proposition. So anyway, I took it upon myself to write this paper. The purpose of the paper is not theological. The purpose of the paper is historical. And the historical purpose is to try as best as I can with the resources I have to trace the development in LDS theology of this idea that Jesus is the elder brother of all mankind in the spirit. All right, so that got published in 2006, BYU Studies. And about a week ago, maybe 10 days ago, it was a text, wasn't it, Paul, that you sent me?
I believe so.
Yeah, and I don't have it here on my phone, but it just said that Paul had, I think, just stumbled upon this paper and
Yes.
that he had read it and he was excited about it and wanted to talk with me about it. And I'll let you tell the story from your side there, Paul.
Well, there's not much to tell except to say that I was surprised that it was possible to do the historical analysis that you achieved in that paper, that you were able to pinpoint exactly when the first usage of Jesus as our elder brother occurred, which I believe one reference was in June of 1844, just shortly before Joseph Smith's murder, June 22nd or something. But most of it happened after his murder. Principally, it became really official, I suppose, on October 6th of 1844 when Brigham Young mentioned it, not vaguely, but fairly clearly in the October conference of 1844, which happened after the trial of Sidney Rigdon in August of 1844. So he was speaking as president of the Council of the 12, which had assumed the presidency of the church as a group of 12. So
Now,
that was the first heresy of the apostolate, I consider. The first heresy of the apostleship was demoting Jesus from being the supreme being to being a second-class divinity by being our elder brother, which I think contradicts the Book of Mormon. So my view has always been, I mean, I've said this since the early 60s when I first joined the church, that the main reason for being a Mormon was to believe that Jesus was the eternal God manifesting himself to all nations, which is what it says on the title page of the Book of Mormon. And that was abandoned as soon as Joseph Smith was dead. And I'm not sure Joseph Smith understood it with great clarity. He doesn't dwell on it. He doesn't contradict the idea, but he doesn't dwell on it. So there we are. My view has always been that you can't have an infinite atonement unless it's done by an infinite being, which would suggest that Jesus, who is Jehovah, was the supreme being.
and my understanding from talking with you, correct me if I'm wrong, was that some of your enthusiasm about this paper is that it demonstrated historically a proposition that you had already independently and previously arrived at theologically.
Yes, a long time ago. And in 2014, I wrote a book called The Serpent and the Dove, which was an analysis of the temple endowment. And there are three main chapters. And in the first chapter, I talk about the Godhead of the temple, which is very peculiar because you have Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael, and these are name titles that seem to float around without being attached to any personages. But I deal with that in the first chapter, and in there I try to explain, going through Joseph Smith's discourses and the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, what I think the texts of Mormonism are trying to tell us. Now, again, I say a couple of things. First of all, I'm not trying to tell people what is true. because I don't do that. You have to go to Denver Snuffer or Russell M. Nelson or somebody, and they will tell you what's true. I can only, I'm a literary guy, so I'm telling you what I believe the texts say. And I don't think they're Trinitarian. They're certainly not tritheistic. I don't think they're modalist. I don't think they correspond to the teachings of the Godhead that were set forth in the first 7 ecumenical councils from 325 AD to 737. I don't think any of those things. I think Mormonism is very peculiar in its presentation of a Godhead, and it's extremely complex. But I think it's trying to answer the question, and I'll stop here with this last remark. It's trying to resolve the problem of the atonement being based on a murder. The biggest problem I ever saw about the Trinity, and even Mormons, there's a Heavenly Father who kills his son to save his creations, which I cynically say save his real estate. I don't believe that you can have a very good theology that's harmless if you have a Heavenly Father murdering his son to save his creations. That was the problem. And I don't believe it. And I think the Book of Mormon, Mosiah 15 particularly, Alma 11, there's 2 Nephi 2 and 11, they are all trying to deal with this problem that the atonement cannot possibly be based on God killing someone else to save his creations, that God himself comes down and dies.
As I mentioned on the phone with you the other day, when Jesus says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends," we get that. We understand that. But it takes on a different hue if Jesus had said, "No greater love hath no man for than this, that he kill his son for his friends."
Yeah, or he go along with it. I mean, that's every despot's dream, is that people are willing to lay down their lives for the despot. You know, that we are willing to, sacrifice so that the top of the that sound you hear will go away in a second. That you sacrifice for the guy at the top, so that guy at the top doesn't have to suffer. That was the problem that the Greek fathers had in the second century, because they believed that suffering was a sign of weakness, and a sign of impoverishment, or a sign of and it was a sign of the absence of divinity. And so they had to figure out a way that they think God couldn't suffer because God's perfect. How could a perfect being suffer? So what they did was they tried to extract suffering from the features of the divinity. And so they had to create a second person of the Godhead who could then be sacrificed to preserve the inviolability and perfection of the first person of the Godhead. And so they invented this horrible idea, and not all the bishops in 325 or thereafter agreed with it, but they came up with a verbal formula that they could all sign off on, and then they could go back to their various bishoprics, and they could kind of expatiate pretty much what they wanted. And ultimately that led to a number of schisms in the Christian church.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to have the Father suffering, because that would result in the heresy of patripassianism.
Yes.
The Father suffering. There's a lot of heresies. There's a lot of ways to go wrong in understanding the Godhead over the course of Christian history, isn't there?
Well, that's the other thing I wanted to say, is that even though I'm kind of an amateur theologian, because there's no way to be a professional theologian in Mormonism, we don't have a school of divinity, we have a law school instead. You can't, theology doesn't save. It's true that bad theology can lead to bad behavior, but it doesn't really save. What saves is love. In a nutshell, like you said, greater love hath no man, that you lay down your life for your friends. And there's something I want to read to you later about this that I think is pertinent. I hope I don't forget.
Is it right there in front of you? I wouldn't want you to forget.
Okay, I'll see. I have it right now.
Okay.
I'll read it to you. To me, it's one of the most important. It's from a book called The Crucified God by Jürgen Moltmann, who was in the 60s a prominent German theologian. And I want to read this to you. A God who cannot suffer is poorer than any man. For a God who is incapable of suffering is a being who cannot be involved. Suffering and injustice do not affect him. And because he is so completely insensitive, he cannot be affected or shaken by anything. He cannot weep, for he has no tears. But the one who cannot suffer cannot love either. I'll read that again. But the one who cannot suffer cannot love either. So he is also a loveless being. Aristotle's God cannot love. He can only be loved by all non-divine beings by virtue of his perfection and beauty, and in this way draw them to him. But the unmoved mover is a loveless beloved. A God who is only omnipotent is in himself an incomplete being, for he cannot experience helplessness and powerlessness. Omnipotence can indeed be longed for and worshipped by helpless men, but omnipotence is never loved, it is only feared. What sort of a being then would be a God who is only almighty? He would be a being without experience, a being without destiny, and a being who is loved by no one. A man who experiences helplessness, a man who suffers because he loves, a man who can die, is therefore a richer being than an omnipotent God who cannot suffer, cannot love, and cannot die. Well, I think it was that idea that somehow was the subtext of Mosiah 15, where it basically says that God himself will descend into the world and die for his creations, because otherwise you have a loveless God.
Very interesting. Thank you for reading that to us. I tell you what, I'm going to come to this part of the program. I'm going to put the paper that was published in BYU Studies back in 2006 up on the screen, and hopefully I can maneuver this a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to hit some of the high points of it so you can see how it's structured, how it comes to the conclusions it comes to, and hopefully I can call on maybe Paul and Bill to read a little bit if my voice is failing. I'll try and describe more than read, okay? All right, so here we go. If we add this to stage, there it is. So that's from May 1st, 2006, Jesus Christ as Elder Brother. It's got to be the worst title of anything I've ever titled in my life, but I guess it does the job. That's what it's about. All right, so going down, we get down to Jesus Christ as Elder Brother. By the way, I am not sure that that is completely on the screen, is it? Let's see here. There it is. Now it's on the screen. It's a little bit smaller, so I apologize for that. We've already gone over everything in the introduction, and we don't need to belabor that point. So what we're looking at, of course, is different statements or reports of statements that were made historically on this issue. And contemporaneously recorded statements made at or around the time of the incident that it's describing. We have several of these, but they begin in 1844, which is, of course, in June, the year that Joseph Smith died. And it goes to 1846. So for those 2 years, first you got June 22nd, 1844. That's Orson Pratt. And I think you'd mentioned that one earlier, Paul. And what he says is he's over in his prophetic almanac for 1845, where he says, "What is man? The offspring of God. What is God? The father of man. Who is Jesus Christ? He is our brother." Capital B. And that is basically all he says. He was begotten and born of God. He doesn't really give a lot of explanation as to why he says he is our brother, if he means it literally or in some more figurative sense. Doesn't go into that. July 9th, 1844, Willard Richards and John Taylor, in their letter of instruction, include the phrase that the saints suffer persecution so that they, quote, might obtain their inheritance in that kingdom of their heavenly Father, which Jesus, their elder brother, had gone to prepare for them. So that sounds familiar. October 6, 1844, and Paul mentioned this one too, Brigham Young at the October 1844 conference of the church. There is a report of Brigham Young saying, he, Brigham Young, next showed how the saints are delivered up in their progress from those who give them up to the high council and from the high council to the prophet, and from the prophet to the son, the elder brother, and from the son to his father. Not exactly clear that he's talking about this, but he is reported as having said this. January 1st. Go ahead, Paul.
I can't see the document. It's not appearing on my screen, and I don't know whether you need to know that.
Well, I will tell you, I can see it. Can you see it, Bill? Can people out there see it?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes we do have this problem.
Yes. So I do, but I shouldn't be the final judge of that, because you're right. They're saying nothing here either. So RFM, if you will, if you'll remove it, so hit the three dots, hit remove on the down there below, hit those three dots on the actual document down below, and remove it from the screen, and then add it back in. So they're all saying not on the screens. Yep. And last time, was it
there before?
Yes.
And then it stopped.
Yeah.
Yes. It never was on when you started reading it, but it was earlier when we looked at it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It was on.
All right. Let me see if I can get this.
I should have said something earlier.
Sorry, folks. This is StreamYard, and there's been a few hiccups lately with it. I really love the program, so kudos to the folks at StreamYard, and they do tend to resolve things quickly, but once in a while. Whoops, sorry, RFM. I was trying to.
How is that?
I can see that.
Oh, if you can see it, then I'm guessing other people can see it too.
Right. You might want to enlarge it a bit, but it's.
They're saying there it is, so we are good.
Okay. Better? Yeah. Okay. So there's the July 9th, 1840. Excuse me. The first one was the June 22nd, 1844 Orson Pratt comment that we mentioned. Then it goes down to July 9th, 1844. That's the Willard Richards and John Taylor letter. October 6th, 1844. Once again, I want to say that Brigham Young, next showed how the saints are delivered up in their progress from those who give them up to the high council, and from the high council to the prophet, and from the prophet to the son, the elder brother, and from the son to his father. January 1st, 1845, William W. Phelps. And Phelps just mentions in an article about how Lucifer fights against, quote, Jesus Christ, our eldest brother. June 1st, 1845, probably William W. Phelps, talking about even the elder brother could do nothing but what he had seen his father do in eternities before. And we recognize that quote referencing Jesus in other contexts. So September 5th, 1846, John Taylor writes a passage of poetic verse to a Miss Abby Jane Hart of New York City. Tread in the footsteps of thine elder brother Jesus, the Prince of Peace, for whom a body was prepared. So we have those. I think there's about 6 of those between 1844 and 1846 that I was able to locate. Now, in this article, it also goes through, I believe it's 3 statements and reminiscences that do put Joseph Smith as having taught this idea about elder brother, or at least made the comment about elder brother, but they're not contemporaneous. They were written up to a year and sometimes many years later. And the problem with that is that, of course, when you're dealing with a situation like a developing doctrine, that by the time you're writing it, if that doctrine has already developed and become commonplace and established within the church, your recollection of what someone else said, like Joseph Smith, before that doctrine became established, is much more likely to be contaminated with the idea that, yeah, he did talk about it back then, because, of course, everybody believes it now. So Joseph Smith would have been talking about it too, right? So there was a personal reminiscence from Zebedee Coltrane, 1870. That's how long after that is. And this is a story he told on a couple of occasions about being with Joseph Smith and saying, at another time, after fasting and prayer, Joseph told us that we should see the glory of God. And I saw a personage passing through the room as plainly as I see you now. Joseph asked us if we knew who it was, and answered himself, that is Jesus, our elder brother, the Son of God. Okay. So you could see how, trying to remember something that long after, it would be easy to put in our elder brother as a descriptor of Jesus in Joseph Smith's mouth, because it had become established among the saints in the Rocky Mountains. Now, there's another one, the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt. He wrote this. The incident he's recounting happened in 1839, but it's in his autobiography, which was written a number of years after Joseph Smith died. And I deal with that there. I don't want to get too much off in the weeds here. I'm afraid I'll be losing the audience. But basically, there's good reason to think, yeah, he didn't really say Joseph Smith said that. What he said was, I felt that God was my heavenly Father indeed, partly speaking first person, that Jesus was my brother. That's the key part of it, right? I felt that Jesus was my brother. He doesn't actually say Joseph Smith taught it even. And this, once again, is a late reminiscence. The final one that I had to deal with was the Journal of George Laub. This would have been relating a discourse by Joseph Smith on April 6, 1843. I think he probably didn't get around to reading it, writing it down until 1845. So now we have that issue. Is he remembering something? Even in 1845, this doctrine is already starting to pick up steam. It's right at that critical juncture. But what he recalled Joseph Smith is writing or saying on April 6, 1843, in his journal, George Laub writing, they saw till time should be no more, and they spake concerning the redemption of this world. And Jesus Christ, being the greater light, or of more intelligence, for he loved righteousness and hated iniquity, he being the elder brother, presented himself for to come and redeem this world, as was his right by inheritance. So those are those things. And I just realized that after the first, I'm actually color coding. I'm color coding these highlights. The first one was green. Now we're into the pink. And my whole idea was stop after the first section and then go to Bill and Paul for their comments. I blew right through the green, went to the pink. Let's go ahead and say, Bill, first off, I haven't heard a lot from you tonight. Do you have any comments about any of this so far?
Yeah, so the things I'm thinking about, we talked, I don't know if it was last week on this show or if it was Mormonism After Dark or the newscast, but we were talking about Jesus and whether he had, died on this planet, made an atonement, or whether it was on some other planet, or whether it had happened at some other point in this Earth's history. And, there's some speculation there to try to figure out how to make the theology of Mormonism coherent. And we just sort of came to the conclusion that you can't. But when I hear them mention elder brother, I think the most rational thing is it's elder brother. It's the first of God's children. He's the oldest of all at least the males. And of course, females get no mention. So we're left to assume that we're talking just the earliest child, but at least the earliest male. But other possibilities are elder brother, meaning the brother who took on the most, did the most. Like there's a way that elder could be used as one who has authority over others. And then I also thought too, if he made an atonement on some other planet at some other time, elder brother could also reference the fact that he actually did go through the plan of salvation as God is, man once was, as man is, God made, or as man is, God once was, as God is, man may become. And we were sort of throwing out the idea that Jesus is the anomaly outside of that. Well, if Jesus wasn't the anomaly outside of that, he would also be our elder brother in that sense as well, having gone through the plan of salvation, taken on a body. But when you start to get that deep, none of this adds up or makes sense. And so I'm just going to defer to the two of you and go with the most rational explanation that it means Jesus is the older brother.
Well,
my experience has been that often it's a matter of exchanging one set of problems for another set of problems.
Yes, amen.
I think the problem comes when trying to employ rationality to explain something that is essentially mythical. I mean, the problem with rationality is that it's based on cause and effect. And even physicists tell us that time doesn't necessarily flow in one direction, which means that not only are there causes that are pushing us toward the future, there are things in the future that are pulling us toward a future. And so, the best of the physicists are telling us this now, and people can search it out and watch YouTube videos about it. So the idea that you'd see this in this Newtonian sense, in this hyper-rationalistic way, is silly. First of all, the idea that he was our brother in the spirit world, well, if my view is correct, that he was the supreme being, he was not our brother in the spirit sense, because he pre-existed the space-time continuum and he's the supreme being that creates it. So he's not that. He's not one of the spirit children. In fact, Joseph Smith gave a discourse, which you can find, I think it's on page 157 of the Teaching of the Prophet Joseph Smith, where he says that Adam is the father of our spirits, and that Adam will eventually turn over his stewardship to Christ. Makes that very clear. And so I think it may be that this, in the myth, it's Adam who is not only the father of our mortal bodies and Eve, but the father of our spirits as well. But that doesn't include Jesus, who created the angels, of which Michael Adam is one. As whether he is certainly a brother of us in mortality, because if he's a member of the human race when he incarnates. So in that sense, he's our brother, certainly not our elder brother, because
Maybe a distant cousin.
yeah, well, he's in the same sense that you and I are brothers. Very distant.
Well, not at all.
Not at all. Except that we're all, brothers in the sense that we're part of the human family.
There is a brotherhood of man.
That's right. And there is also the concept of the resurrection, because Jesus is the first to be resurrected of the people of the earth. And I suppose. And so there's a sense in which there he is kind of firstborn in the resurrection sense, but certainly not our brother in that sense, because we don't die on the cross with him, we don't rise again, we don't harrow hell, we don't go below all things to be in and through all things. We have no idea what those sentences really mean ultimately.
We don't harrow hell? That's too bad. I was up for a good hell harrowing tonight.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing about it. The one thing about religion is that it is a feeding ground for flippancy. And ex-Mormons are great at this, because Mormonism is so damaging. It interferes with people's sexual lives so deeply. It hurts people's families so badly. It involves itself in greed and politics so thoroughly that when you can finally break away for it, I have no judgment for, heaping upon the church the flippancy it deserves. But theology is a different issue. So if you believe in a theology where the presiding God can kill his son to save his real estate, then you basically got a pattern there that justifies the church selling out its LGBTQ members, or being misogynist, or standing with the Republicans against workers and unions. A church that basically covers up sexual abuse of children in order to save its leaders. And where is that pattern to be found? It's found in the same place that the Catholics find it, in a Godhead where the supreme being is above the rules and can then use somebody else to save his real estate. So you have a very bad theology there. And it's worked. We organize our power structures based upon our mythologies, whether we like it or not. And Western civilization has been heavily indebted to this concept that came out of 325 of, an unmoved mover who is not going to be moved by love and suffering. He's going to be above it all, as I read before. And that has informed our power structures on earth, certainly ever since the crucifixion.
Yeah, you make a great point, which is when the phrase, the cliche comes up, lying for the Lord, if we were to get these men cornered and be able to ask them questions and they were forced to answer, even if we couldn't force them necessarily to tell the truth, just to tell whatever they wanted to say, their argument would be that they're lying for the Lord. They're lying on behalf of God. They're not lying because they want to be liars. They're lying because God requires of them to be deceptive in order to protect the church.
100% right, Bill, because it was racism. They aren't racist. It was God that was racist. God was the one who had the priesthood ban. It was God. I mean, Dallin Oaks won't talk to his grandson, who is gay, and the director of Ballet West, the musical director. He won't talk to him because to get near his grandson means to contaminate himself. It's worse than being kosher. It's worse than, not mixing milk and meat and spending hours and hours and hours and hours cleaning off all the crumbs so that you don't mix, you have to keep a kosher kitchen. It's worse than that because it is soul damaging. And how do you, I knew Dallin. I've asked myself, what happened to him? Well, what happens goes back to the other thing I said in the text I sent to RFM that was part of this. I said the first great heresy is about making Christ a lesser divinity. And the only way that's possible is by having an apostolic coup, where the apostles in 1844 decide that they can organize the first presidency. It took 3 years, but yeah, they decide that they can run the church. Well, that's completely contrary to the revelations. There's nothing in Mormon scripture that allows the apostles to create a first presidency or to set up a seniority system, whether it's by age or continuous uninterrupted service in the Council of the 12. There's nothing like that. There's nothing that says that you have to wait. The church proceeds by funerals. You have to wait for the oldest apostle to die before you can progress to the next agenda that the guy has had for 30 or 40 years. And finally he comes and he's able to say, I don't care what Gordon B. Hinckley said. I don't care that Thomas Monson used to sing, I'm a Mormon boy. We're not going to use the word Mormon anymore. He's going to throw all the previous apostles and prophets under the bus and say that, whenever we say Mormon, it delights Satan, because God doesn't like nicknames, even though the holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God has a nickname, which is the Melchizedek priesthood, and God doesn't mind that. So we are left with a bunch of apostles who were never intended to run the church, who were supposed to be missionaries and preach Christ and him crucified. And of course, they, like the Catholics, don't want a God that gets crucified. They want a God who crucifies somebody else, so that they can be justified in their patriarchy, in their misogyny, in their homophobia, in their xenophobia, in their elitism, in their greed.
Paul, I got to tell you, I don't know how many times I've heard you talk about this, but tonight,
I'm get excommunicated.
Paul, but tonight
Yes.
I'm really getting it. I'm getting it. I'm picking up on what you're laying down. It is making sense now to me.
And I have to add just one other little sentence, and that is, since the death of Joseph Smith, and he didn't make things perfectly clear, honestly. He left an unfinished symphony of theology, and we have to finish it, and we're not good at it. It's turned into cacophony, because you have apostle after apostle after apostle, president after church president after church president, sinking further and further into confusion, because they're not good at reading scripture. They're not good at, everybody wants to see the Book of Mormon as an historical text. Well, they haven't. There are 1 million mounds in North America, 1 million mounds, and 90% of them have been destroyed. So that leaves about 100,000 untouched mounds left, and they won't let you look in them. Is there any evidence in those mounds that there was some kind of, people of the Book of Mormon relics there? I don't think so, but you don't know until you actually look in. So I guess the jury's out on that question. But the Book of Mormon isn't a historical text. It's a visionary text. It's not pointing to the mounds. It's not pointing even to its own literary devices like chiasmus. It's pointing to Jesus Christ. It's trying to tell you that you should not believe in a God who is not willing to suffer with you and suffer for you. And you don't find him in palaces. When Trump locks up those Hispanic kids in cages again, that's where you're going to find Jesus, in those cages. And if you want to find him, you're not going to find him, in those mega churches in Texas where the guy has 2 jets and is asking for more money. You're going to find him in the cages and with the Holocaust victims. That's where you're going to find him.
Paul, I've just got to make a comment here, okay? Because you're making me think new things, put dots together in new ways, okay? And it makes me think, when you're talking about the theology of having a God who can do no wrong, right? Who's totally in control, and everybody else has to do what they say and be sacrificed when the time is necessary, right? Who else but a Mormon prophet, President Nelson, could take a story as amazing as Jacob wrestling with an angel / God and winning, by the way, until the angel / God cheated. However, who could take a story like that and make the moral that we need to submit ourselves completely to God?
Yeah,
Because
then
what
what
he
they have,
says is that means let God prevail, which is not what it means, but
not
that's
a,
what he says it means.
no, what they have now is what they used to believe in is grace briefly, back in the 90s, briefly.
It
And
was a
now
good time.
they believe in covenantal grace, which means you're not going to get grace unless you keep all the covenants, which is just a transactional relationship with God. It's just awful. Now, there was a guy on this heretic movie. I watched that video you guys made. I thought it was excellent. And the guy apparently says, religion is control. But that's the opposite is true. Religion is the abdication of control, which is what Christ does on the cross. He abdicates patriarchy. He abdicates hierarchy. He abdicates being an elitist. He sinks below all that. We don't think about what this means. And because we don't want that, we want a strong man. We want Christ to be an icon for power that justifies us objectifying and presiding over and dominating and enslaving other people. That's what we want.
And you suggested that's why Mormonism focuses on the tomb and not the cross.
Yeah, not the tomb. If it were only the tomb.
Well, the
new
open
logo is the outline of the Christus statue.
Yes.
So Mormonism focuses on the resurrection, which is the closest thing we can get to success. I mean, Mormonism, to use William James's statement, he says Americans worship the bitch goddess success. Well, it could have been the bastard goddess success. Without, you could say it that way. But the fact of the matter is that Mormons love success. They love a winner. But the problem with that is that if you look at the crucifix, there's not just the cross there, but you see Jesus nailed to the cross. That's the supreme being. And the greatest moment in history, as was pointed out by the philosopher Slovan Žižek, he's still alive. He once said on a video I watched, he says, the greatest moment in human history was when Christ cried out, God cries out from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And he suffers the ultimate abyss, the ultimate existential crisis. The apostles, that's what they were supposed to teach. Christ and him crucified, but instead they want to have Christ and him resurrected or ascended or in charge of our stakes and wards or worried about tattoos and body piercings and concerned about nosing into people's family affairs where that's not Christ's job. Christ's job is to eliminate death so that we don't go to it. What did you call it? An oubliette?
And I think I mispronounced it. It might be oubliette, but
yeah. Oubliette. No,
it's much bigger than an oubliette, but I couldn't resist using the word.
It eliminates death so that we all have a life hereafter where we have to make an accounting for what we've done to other people. And
justice.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons I think religion came to be.
Yeah.
Because we want the bad guy to get it, man. He deserves it. And he's just prospering and it's pissing me off. And this can't be right.
But
here I am. I'm so good, but I'm so poor. And I keep getting smacked upside the head. Something's got to happen to make that right.
And then when you die, you
bring him
find out
down.
that rather than the other guy being judged, what you find out is that you see yourself from that other person's perspective. And the perspective of every individual you have ever met in your whole life, you see how you were from their perspective. Well, that's not God doling out the judgment. That's just a kind of theory of reality. Now, I don't know if this is going to happen. I don't know if the message that I see embedded in Mormon text is true. I mean, I certainly can't I would never testify to that or anything like that. I'm not being a missionary. I'm just pointing out alternative ways of looking at things. That's what a theologian does, as opposed to an historian. An historian is trying to tie things to documents and artifacts and time periods to give a sense of, what happened, accuracy. But a theologian is different. You're trying to show what the possibilities are and help us move away from a belief structure that is essentially harmful.
Okay. Well, a lot of people, I'm seeing a lot of comments, and I know Bill's putting them up on the board, and thank you for that, Bill, that are really liking what it is you're saying. They appreciate it. They find you a deep thinker.
Dan Vogel, I saw saying theology makes no sense. Well, that's like saying that Hamlet makes no sense because you can't find Elsinore and you can't find Ophelia's burial spot, or you can't find any remnants of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So the play makes no sense. Well, of course it makes sense. Art makes sense. Literature makes sense. Even greedy rich people, when they finally make enough money, they want to leave their factory and go someplace where they can contemplate art. So theology does make sense. You have to see it as in a poetical, mythopoetic terms.
Oh, Dan's with me. I'm not sure where I am, but apparently Dan's with me. Thank you, Dan. It's always nice to be with you too. I tell you what, since we've got to a place here, we can go back to the paper. I'm not gonna go through all the stuff that there was. Maybe some other time it'll be fine. But there's at least one point that I want to bring up that I think was really significant in this. You already have the idea that it was late breaking news, this idea about elder brother. And what ends up happening, and I'll go ahead and just talk to the camera here. What ends up happening is that it appears that this idea, which starts as sort of a reference, just a reference with no explanation by, I think it was Orson Pratt in June of 1844, develops and it becomes repeated and repeated. And it's so attractive that it becomes ingrained in the Mormon doctrine. There are very few people who would not think that in Mormonism, it is a doctrine that Jesus is our elder brother in the spirit. That's part of the doctrine. And I wanted to say also, one of the things that surprised me about this paper and studying it, I had this idea in my head, looking at Christian history, the history of the church, the Christian church for 2,000 years, that it would take centuries for something that was extra biblical to come in, to influence the church, to be adopted by a few people, then more people, then people in leadership do it, and finally it rolls into a place where it becomes doctrine. What I was shocked by was how quickly this can happen, how something can go from 0 to 60 and become a doctrine just over the course of a number of years and even decades, years. Okay. So having said that, we get to this point where the reason that it is so attractive to Mormonism, I think, is because they take two expressions from the scriptures. There's Jesus being described as the firstborn. Okay. And Mormons immediately link that to his being the firstborn in the spirit.
Yeah.
When actually the scriptures
don't do that.
Tend to, they don't do that. But what they do tend to do is they understand it, or they express it the same way that most Christians understand it, which is that he is the first fruits of the resurrection.
That's right.
He was the first being to be resurrected. He was the firstborn.
Right.
Okay. So having said that, there's another expression, that's firstborn, and then there's the only begotten, right?
Yeah.
He's described as the firstborn in the scriptures. He's described as the only begotten in the scriptures. So
Right.
you got firstborn, you got only begotten. We talked about firstborn, only begotten. Now, Mormons understand that to be, well, he's not his only begotten because, I mean, there's me too, right? Don't forget me and the billions of others. So he's not the only begotten. So therefore, in the spirit, so therefore he must be the only begotten in the flesh. It's talking about on this planet, that he is the only begotten person and only begotten son of God, right? The only begotten. Okay. So having said that, what Mormons have done, interestingly, is they have taken those two scriptural expressions, firstborn of God, the firstborn, and the only begotten. And they have interpreted them to mean the firstborn in the spirit and the only begotten in the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Both of those clauses that describe them at the end are glosses. They are not in the scriptures. So in other words, the firstborn in the spirit is not found in the scriptures. In the spirit is a gloss that's been added by Mormons to the expression firstborn. And this was a shock to me. I would have sworn it was in the scriptures.
Yeah.
But it's not, because we hear it all the time, right? That he was the firstborn in the spirit. No, it's not in the scriptures. And the only begotten in the flesh, well, only begotten is in the scriptures, but not in the flesh after it. Pretty sure on that one, positive on the first one. Now, what ends up happening is that once you interpret those two scriptural statements in that way and put it against Mormon theology, then Jesus ends up being the firstborn in the spirit, right? So he's the older brother. And it makes absolute sense from that perspective. So here's one thing I want to say is that these two expressions, the Mormon expressions, firstborn in the spirit, only begotten in the flesh, at least according to my research, the first time both of them appear is in the 1909 First Presidency Statement. Okay?
09.
1909. They deal with it very briefly, but they mention those two things, and it follows as a logical conclusion.
Yeah.
From the propositions, the two propositions, and it follows naturally, just like it does today. So that's one of the things that's interesting, is that it ends up being built upon two glosses on the scriptures that Mormons have put on them and used them to the point that it was a surprise to me, and maybe a surprise to some of you, to find out they're not actually in the scriptures in that way.
Can I just add?
Yeah, please do.
There's an echo. I mean, the only begotten in the flesh, at least in some way, my brain tells me that that's at least connected to the teaching by Brigham Young much earlier than 1909, that God and Mary had a tangible sexual encounter, which led to Jesus being born. Hence, what separates Jesus being born in the flesh from the rest of us being born in the flesh, at least according to Brigham Young, is that there was a sexual intercourse that took place. And hence, Jesus is a direct offspring of God, only begotten of the Father. So even though the term may not be used until later, it seems like there's some theological echoes of that in earlier stuff with the whole God begotten Jesus through an actual act.
Yeah, I mean, it's the God Brigham Young was talking about was Adam or Michael.
Sure.
And so if you see the
only God with which we have to do with.
Yeah, which is if in the myth, Michael Adam is the father of our spirits and the father of our bodies on the earth, and if, as it says in the discourse Joseph Smith gave on this, because he's the source of this, at the end he says, and then in Adam on Diamond, Adam will call a great council and we'll all be there, and then he says, and then Christ will be there, and Adam, Michael, will deliver up his stewardship to Christ. So, but retain his standing as head of the human family, and Michael. So Michael is subordinate to Christ. And the idea of the only begotten, the way, there are many ways to interpret these different appellations, but one way is to say that God is the only infinite being, that is, a being without creation. The rest of us are all created beings, and he's an uncreated divinity. He's the only uncreated divinity to have entered into mortality. And that's why he's the only begotten. He's the only begotten because he's the supreme being, becomes lower than the angels, comes through the angels to be born on earth. So it's all of this stuff, like Dan says, it all seems fairly ridiculous until you actually start reading quantum mechanics, and then you realize these are parallel ridiculousness things, except one has math behind it and the other has humanities behind it, and these everything we know is subject to, we can't be sure of anything. which is very painful for people who want certainty. And Mormons want to be right more than they want to be saved. They lust after certainty. And so they're very disappointed when their religion has failed to develop. The brethren have promised them certainty. The brethren have made their career out of promising people certainty, but they can't deliver. And what they deliver instead is a lot of other painful things, and then people leave. Who can blame them? I have no judgment for people like that. And I have no judgment for people who, just reject theology as fantasy, although they do confuse fantasy and the imagination. Those are two different things.
I imagine they are. So, Paul, let me just go here because on this paper, by the way, I'm just one point other than this, which I did go to the conclusion. It's highlighted in red there. And it does say what I had thought it said. The 1909 First Presidency Statement, the origin of man, and that's why it's not dealing a lot with Jesus, because it's talking about evolution, right? The origin of man used the elder brother term and introduced two new phrases to describe the Savior. Number one, that he is the firstborn in the spirit, and two, that he is the only begotten in the flesh. These two phrases, the highlighted portions of which seem to appear for the first time with the 1909 statement, have since gained common currency in the LDS vernacular. The logical progression found in the 1909 origin of man statement is consistent with the earlier reasoning of Orson Pratt. And when I say earlier reasoning of Orson Pratt, I mean an 1871 statement that he made on it, which we've skipped over for purposes of brevity. So that's just re-emphasizing that and clarifying that my recollection was right on that. Both of those are scriptural glosses. Okay.
I want to ask you a question, and you too, Bill, if you know this. This 1909 statement that you've just referenced, there was another statement, I thought it was in 1916 or something, by Joseph F. Smith about the Christ. It was
serious.
And I think that was an expansion upon the lines you just quoted.
Yes, it was dealing much more with how is it that Jesus is the Father, and giving all these different ways of how he's the Father without his actually being the Father.
Right. While still being the elder brother and preserving patriarchy.
Right. And one of the things I point out there is that the 1909 statement is very tepid about this elder brother thing. It says, you can say he's your elder brother without impropriety. Right. But we should remember that he's in essence greater than us all, essentially greater than us all. It almost sounds like there's a difference of opinion that they're trying to cater to, people with a different opinion, while still putting this statement together that the first presidency can sign.
Right.
Okay, so here's the last thing I want to talk about, because I thought this was very, very interesting. Because the idea is that, well, let me just read this, okay, and hopefully it'll explain itself. Here. Yes. Okay. Other interpretations of brother, father, and firstborn. Now, this is just only going to go down to there, so don't panic. The two scriptural predicates that one, Jesus is the firstborn of the Father, and two, all human beings are the literal spirit children of God the Father, may at first blush suggest that Jesus is, and in fact must be, the elder spirit brother of all God's children. But there are other interpretations that may be drawn from these two scriptural predicates. A passage from the Book of Mormon illustrates an alternate meaning when using familial titles. And I can't tell you how excited I was when I was reading the Book of Mormon and at the same time thinking about this concept, and came upon this passage, which is a nothing passage, which I don't think has ever been cited in General Conference or any kind of manual, okay? But it becomes critical for purposes of this specific thing. And this is what it says about familial titles. Wherefore, after my father Lehi, this is Nephi writing it, wherefore, after my father Lehi had made an end of speaking concerning the prophecies of Joseph, he called the children of Laman, his sons and his daughters, so Laman's sons and his daughters, and said unto them, behold, my sons and my daughters, who are the sons and daughters of my firstborn. I would that ye should give ear unto my word. 2 Nephi 4:3. In this passage, we see that Laman is the firstborn of Lehi, and that Laman's children are referred to by Lehi as the sons and daughters of Lehi. From this, one would not be justified in concluding that Laman is the elder brother of his own sons and daughters. So those two predicates that we started with that get interpreted by members of the church almost exclusively to mean that Jesus must be our elder brother in the spirit don't necessarily stand for that proposition at all. And there's actually a passage in the Book of Mormon that stands for that proposition. Similarly, the fact that Jesus is the firstborn of the Father and the fact that men and women are the literal sons and daughters of the Father does not necessarily lead to the conclusion that Jesus is the elder brother of humankind. Brigham Young may have held a similar view in this regard. I can't believe what they let me get away with in this, as it is apparent that he did not care to distinguish between exalted beings found along the eternal continuum. All are of the same family, and it is not necessary to distinguish between the differing status of each member of the Godhead. I think they edited it in such a way that it couldn't just come out and say it, but the concepts are still there. Any thoughts about that? Paul? Nothing?
Well, like I say, to approach theology from a Newtonian, model, that is, that eliminates the possibility of simultaneity, which means that you can have layered possibilities. We understand this in physics. In physics, we understand, if we do our reading on quantum physics, we understand that such a thing as superposition. You can have an expression of reality being a wave, and at the same time, it's a particle. And that's in superposition until the wave function collapses it upon observation and measurement into a particle. When you're not observing it, you're not measuring it, the only way to express the reality is through a series of possibilities or potentialities that are not, it's not an objective reality, it's a set of possibilities. So what physics is doing at the razor's edge of physics is pretty much what Mormon theology has been trying to do in its text for a long time, which is to deal with simultaneity. That is to say, you can have some, you think you're seeing something, like we think we're seeing, this table that I'm sitting at seems solid, but when, that's what the periodic chart tells us. But if we zoom in to the various molecules and the various atoms and the nucleus and the electron shells, we realize that it's mostly space. And then when we look at the up quark and the down quark and the bosons and the leptons and all of these things that form the standard model, we realize, my gosh, it's not what we think. Is it nothing? Is it possible that what we perceive as something is really nothing? Well, no, it's something. It's just that what we've got here is like a wave that upon excitation presents itself in something that we perceive as matter. But underneath the matter, underneath the energy, is something that we can't reach. It's beyond our ability to capture. We have hints of it because the mathematical model suggests it's the reality of it, but there's no experimental evidence of it. So the theory and the experiment are still far apart. You can't harmonize a general relativity, and you can't harmonize it with quantum mechanics because the equations don't match. And so you wind up having fudge factors like dark matter and dark energy, which is like putting a fudge factor in your bank account so it matches with the one at the bank, and you throw in the fudge factor so that the equation works. But you don't have the proof because you can't see the dark matter and you can't see the dark energy. Well, this is exactly what we're talking about in theology. There's just stuff we can't show. And all the effort of historians either to prove religion or to disprove religion is futile, because religion lies outside the materialist paradigm. It's not a materialistic thing that we can use science to get at. And the best scientists know this, and they stay away from it. And as a theologian, I've had to deal with it. Is it true that everything I talk about is really a fantasy? Well, love is not a fantasy. Courage is not a fantasy. The desire that I have to see my loved ones after death and not have them disappear into oblivion is not a fantasy. I may be wrong, but those are genuine concerns. And, they're just as real a concerns as, getting food in our bellies. So my feeling is that after being damaged by Mormonism, it's easy to be flippant about religion. I certainly accept that. I certainly accept being told that it's all junk and what I believe is just nonsense. I have heard it all my life. I'm used to it. I only wish to point out that historians have the same problem because they can't prove anything. They only have documents and artifacts. And in a court of law, you can't introduce those into evidence unless you have a witness, and you can't cross-examine the witnesses. They're all dead. So we ultimately don't know what was meant by this journal entry or this letter or that until you get them on the stand and you say, this sentence, what did you mean by this? And until you do that, you have a good idea. You have plausibility, and sometimes it's highly likely. But, frankly, I would like to know what some of these people really meant when they wrote things down and did certain things. What did they have in mind? And it might turn out to be shockingly different. In my experience as a lawyer, it always turned out to be shockingly different when I looked into it. It was not what I thought.
So it almost sounds like you're saying you really can't know anything.
No, I think that we can't. We know how we feel, and we know our opinions, and there are things we know. We know that I don't want to pull my car in and go too far and drive into the wall of my house. I know I don't want that. I know about that. But when I listen to the physicists tell me that most of that wall is space, I have to think, well, yeah, that's probably true, but I'm still going to observe the stop signs and the semaphores at the intersections. I don't want to get into an accident and ruin my car and my life. Yeah, I mean, there are things we know, but we always have to kind of think, well, the universe seems so strange.
I sense like there's a commonly accepted proposition relating to the past that you're seeking to avoid by this methodology.
Well, all of our knowledge is past knowledge.
Is there something in church history like Joseph Smith and polygamy? I mean, do you accept that, believe that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, Paul?
Well, I did. Now that there's such a kerfuffle about it, I'm thinking about it again. Do I really know? I don't know if he practiced polygamy. I think he did. I believe he did, because I think that the evidence that has been brought forth saying that he didn't would require a mammoth conspiracy that I just don't think could be pulled off. But on the other hand, I'm not an historian of polygamy. I don't like polygamy. I think it's a patriarchal, problem. It creates more patriarchy and more problems for women. I don't think that's good at all. But I can understand why in the early part to the middle part of the 19th century, there were a lot of marital experiments going on. I mean, you've got, for heaven's sakes, Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin Shelley and Lord Byron and the Shakers and the Oneida community and all of these people around trying to do, reform marriage, because it seemed a little bit too imprisoning for people, because adults wanted to have sex with more than one adult, and they wanted to make that, moral, and at the same time, children had to be taken care of. So you just couldn't abandon the women and the children when they reproduced. There were a lot of things that were going on, and to just simply say, and to not see it, Mormon polygamy in the broader context is not being careful.
No, and I didn't mean to get off on a whole thing about polygamy. I was just wondering if there was something going on here. But at any rate, I'm not able to pinpoint it. I don't know what it might be. Maybe there's nothing at all. And maybe I'm just, I don't know.
Do you think there's something in my in my history that would make me want to continue to
No,
believe.
no, not in your history. You value Joseph Smith.
I value Jesus Christ. I don't see Joseph Smith as particularly the hero. I think
But you do find value in the revelations that he brought forth.
Yes, I do. But I also see value in the revelations that were given to William Blake and to Swedenborg and to Mechtild of Magdeburg and to Hildegard von Bingen and to Meister Eckhart. And I see him as a mystic in a long Christian tradition. I just think that some of the things that he said were so bold because all of these other mystics are trying to fit their mystical visions and their mystical insights into the framework of Trinitarianism. But Joseph Smith is, I think, the only mystic that I know of, possibly Swedenborg is also there, where they ignore Trinitarianism. They simply just do not buy the first 7 ecumenical councils' description of the Godhead. And their mysticism basically moves forward apart from that framework. And I find that extraordinarily interesting.
So just to sum up, you would be fine or accepting of Joseph Smith being a prophet who produces scripture that presents true and correct theology and on which you use to base your understanding of theology, but also engage in polygamy. That would be acceptable.
Well, I would see it, how shall I say this? I don't like it, but I didn't like the fact that, Picasso was a womanizer, but I appreciate the Guernica, in the Prado. I don't like the fact that, some of the Turner was really hard to get along with, but he was a great colorist as a painter, right? I don't like the idea that T.S. Eliot locked up his wife in an insane asylum, but was a great poet. I mean, I separate the art and the work of the imagination from the individual. It's not a complete separation, but I'm willing to say, well, gee, if I had been there, I'd have said, Joseph, for God's sake, don't do this because that's all they're going to remember you for. And he did it. And so now we're stuck with it. But I think what the lesson to be learned there is that the myth operates on a separate plane from ethics. And a person can have confused and developing ethics and make mistakes and still see things clearly. It's true with scientists. Edison was a thief, and yet we have the light bulb. So we don't have always moral people giving us a great work product. We sometimes they're less than moral.
I want to ask 2 things. One is just really quick. Are you familiar with Donald Hoffman? Some of the things you said about subatomic particles and your eyes are a VR headset and reality is unknowable and all those things are sort of, you mentioned some of that and connected to other things I just said, and Hoffman seems to, by the way, I'm very interested in that stuff, but that was just a side question.
Hoffman is not my favorite source for this. My favorite source for this is Federico Fagin, who was the inventor of the microchip and a bunch of other, and ARPANET and all of this other stuff. And he's come out with a little book that I've read recently called Irreconcilable. And I would suggest anybody who's interested in what I've been talking about, read his book, because he's able to give you the mathematical foundations for this, for consciousness.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend this episode going into that, but there are 100 things connected to that conversation that would impose that reality is absolutely not what we see out of our eyes.
Absolutely.
Right. And then, so the question I do want to ask that does pertain to this conversation, you keep taking any effort on my part, the audience, RFM, any effort we have to go, hey, we're going to hold you to the facts. And then in this conversation, also the last time we had a conversation with you, you go, look, toss that out. We're talking myth here, everybody. And then my pushback to that is, well, the myth doesn't add up either. The myth is also irrational. The myth, by that I mean, the myth has been framed 1,000 different ways, and those 1,000 ways contradict each other too.
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah.
You're absolutely correct. And there's a lesson to be learned in that, because religion cannot be institutional. Churches, ecclesiology can be institutional. You can have corporate Mormonism. But if you get 100 Mormons together in a room and they tell the truth, none of them will have matching theologies. They will all fudge on some things, they'll accept some things, reject other things. That's because ultimately real religion is very, very subjective. And so the attempt of the church to impose a uniform catechism of Mormonism on the Latter-day Saints and excommunicate people like me who were objecting to that, they're wrong to do that. It's one thing to say, yeah, we're all going to get together and throw sandbags up against the river so our houses don't flood. We're going to help our neighbors, and we're going to, make sure that we don't have predators in the neighborhood, and we're going to watch them. That kind of, the neighborhood watch concept, that's great. But to try to force people into, to shoehorn them into one size fits all theology is absurd. And Joseph Smith said that he doesn't like being like the Methodists. He wants, he didn't like some guy being dragged up before the High Council to be questioned about what he believed, because we should be free to believe and sort it out for ourselves. And
it seems like you take, which by the way, I think is a great truth, but I think you're using it in a different way. And I actually appreciate this. The quote from Joseph Smith that in proving contraries, truth is made manifest. You're essentially going into Mormonism and going, look, none of this meshes with any other part of it. So let's look at all of it and not feel bound to any of it. And what's useful and feels like it makes a big difference in how I show up every day, there's something inspiring there. And hence something came from a greater source than Joseph Smith.
Yeah, I believe theologies should be open. We want closure. We want certainty, and we want a strong man to force it if we can get it. And that is what turns religion, it turns it into crap, to be honest with you. And that's what's happened. I mean, you've got Dallin Oaks, who knows better and is called to be an apostle, has all the resources of the church at his disposal, and he won't talk to his gay grandson. Why? Jesus never said anything about gayness. He said a lot about the poor. We don't do much about that, but he excoriated his own church leaders. We kind of shy away from that. But, we go after body piercings and tattoos and, no masturbation and all of that kind of stuff that has nothing to do with anything about religion.
We definitely go after love of money.
And love of and greed, if I lied on my tax return the way that they lied on their tax return, I would be before a tax tribunal, and I might very well spend time in prison. My clients could not have gotten away with what the church got away with on filings that they got away with. When I was a bankruptcy lawyer, if my clients had done that, they would have had a lot of trouble. But the church seems to just skate by.
Well, that's because God's protecting them.
Yeah, that's just the God.
By the way, I think it was Pelatiah Brown who got hauled up in front of that High Council.
I think you're right, Pelatiah Brown.
If that's true, I deserve
to know more about Mormonism than I do. Than I did. You guys have. I've gone back through the long list of You've talked about every single thing, had huge numbers of conversations with very knowledgeable people. I'm proud of you. I fear that people don't look at it. They're not going to think. They don't want to think. It's too hard to think. That's why, for me, I think about it, but my religion is very private to me. I realize it's very eccentric, and I don't want to broadcast it. I don't want to be the head of a movement. I don't want to tell people how to live their lives because I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. We should open up the phone lines. You remember we do this, right, Paul?
No, but I'm fine.
We let members of our crazy, wild, wacky audience call in and ask some questions.
Well, they might not.
Oh, they will, definitely. They're lining up even now, just like a really spiritual testimony meeting.
I want you to know I like talking to you guys. I understand you take a completely different position from me. I respect you tremendously. And I admire the fact that you have the energy to pull together these videos week after week and come up with new subjects and be researched. It's amazing to me.
Thank you again. We're splicing those two together and putting it out as a short, right, Bill?
Yes. And so the phone lines are open. We'll get to those. And I don't want to say much more. RFM, you maybe, I don't know that you've looked into some of the reality stuff that he's mentioned. I'll just say
no, I've just been sitting here nodding and smiling and pretending I know what Paul's talking about.
Yeah. Some of the research out there, and I'll just buy a moment. So phone lines are open, 662-667-6667 or 662 Mormons. And then if you want to come into the studio, you're welcome to do that too. I'm going to go back here to the comments, and I will put a link here in the YouTube live chat, and you can come into the show that way. You can leave your camera off if you want to be anonymous. I don't want to go into great detail here, but I'll just say a couple things. There's a ton of research coming out right now where they are studying. They found a way. DMT is a drug that you smoke and you blast off for 20 minutes and then you come back down and you're not there long enough really to experience a whole lot. They found a way to give it to people intravenously. And the scientists are coming back from this, having tons of people who are hooked up to intravenous DMT. They're blasting off to some other place. They're meeting beings and they're in some territory. They come back. And the beings are consistent from one person's experience to the other, and the territory has consistency from one person to the other, and that person experiencing the trip over and over again, to the point where the scientists who are involved in the research, I know you're smiling, the scientists involved in the research say, this wasn't what I expected. I expected this to be a hallucinogen. This was just a hallucination they're experiencing. But the data is, at this point, demonstrable that wherever these people are blasting off to, it's some real place, whether it's another dimension, they don't know where it's at, but wherever they're going, it's a real place. And folks, you can go follow the research. It's not just one guy being wacko on YouTube. It's the whole research group having conversations.
Yeah, I want to back up, Bill, on this. It's not conspiracy theory. These are real scientists conducting research at accredited universities. At the University of Virginia, the School of Medicine has a division of perceptual studies. They put out this big book that I've kind of gotten halfway through, talking about all of these paranormal experiences that have been documented with solid scientific evidence. And it's weird. I mean,
it is weird.
There's another guy who's a journalist. His name is Hancock. I forget his first name, but he's gone all over the world and he has videoed the weirdest cities: Göbekli Tepe, Karen Tepe in Turkey, the hieroglyphs and the pictures of the animals that have been carved on. It's completely changed history. And in New Mexico, they find these, footprints that are in the rock, and they dig below the rock. They find more little human footprints that go back 120,000 years in America. I mean, the evidence. This evidence piles up in the back room.
Hancock, which is a different thing than what I'm saying, but I've followed some of that as well.
Right.
Yeah. And Donald Hoffman is a quantum mechanics, quantum physics researcher, and what he argues is that it's common sense if you think about it this way. Dogs obviously see the world different than we do. Mm-hmm. Trees interpret the world, whatever they're doing, it's different than what we do. Cat sees the world different than we do. And we all they're seeing things, smelling things, sensing things that we aren't, that's there. And maybe because they only see in limited amount of colors, they're also missing things that we don't see. Mm-hmm. The moment you acknowledge that, you also then, the next logical step is that you're not seeing things that are there, and you're seeing things that are not there. And whatever reality is, it definitely isn't what a dog sees, which is just as much true. It isn't what a human sees. And hence reality is something else. And Hoffman makes the suggestion that we should consider that our eyes are sort of like a VR headset, and information is being taken in, and we're we're putting it together in what we see in front of us with a table and a roadcaster and my coffee mug and 2 monitors. But whatever it is, it's something other than that. And that doesn't make sense, but also it makes sense. And anyway, I know folks won't get it. It's just way woo. And I get that, 80% of the audience is going to disbelieve that. But I thought
the reason why it's way woo is because people have a worldview that is not grounded in evidence. It's grounded in what they picked up in random reading and conversation. But when you actually look at the actual evidence in peer-reviewed journals by scientists who are of noteworthy scientists who are not just by themselves, but are in teams, and all of this is being gathered at Rice University in Houston in the Archive of the Impossible, where a lot of this information is being made available there digitally. They haven't finished the online categorization of the information because there's so much of it. But it's shocking how much, and this is because since Darwin's bulldog in the 1860s insisted that that materialism and evolution all is settled, and then Max Planck comes along in 1900 and says, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. And then by 1927 you have quantum physics, and nothing has happened since then to really take us out of this except consciousness and this whole slew of stuff that Bill is talking about, which you've got to get tapped into, and then it makes you rethink your religious views.
Yeah,
okay, I got to say 2 things.
Yeah,
actually 3. First is I've got no idea what you 2 have been talking about for the last 15 minutes. But the thing I do know is it wasn't on my bingo card for tonight's show.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm sure there's a percentage
another,
of people out there watching who are, enjoying this.
Yeah, perhaps another time.
I feel like we're broadcasting from the Great High Desert in the American Southwest.
I just thought while we bought a minute,
Art Bell.
while we bought a moment for people to come in, and we do have a phone call in the queue, that I would at least tease people going out and learning about something other than the history of Mormonism. I think that's a big, beautiful world out there. So, all right.
Certainly true.
Okay, we've got a call here. Let me turn this. Caller, what's the name?
Oh, it's Jack Bill.
Jack Bill. How are you doing?
Remember Jack Bill?
No.
I do. Go ahead, Jack.
Thanks, RFM. Hey, Paul, I'm a fan. I own Sanctity of Descent and The Serpent and the Dove. And I've been struggling for a lot of years with the question regarding God. And the question is this: if God is all powerful and all knowing, and he knows everything from the beginning to the end, then how does God maintain integrity when he creates evil beings, whether they're spirits or in the human form, like a Hitler, a Mussolini, a Stalin? And then he wants to put himself in this loving position of being a heavenly father, when he knew in advance, before he ever created them, what they would do. So that's the question that I kind of have posed to multiple religions, and I'm not finding an answer. And I was just wondering if you might have some sort of a comment or maybe some way to help me with that.
Well, the way I would address this, and I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can, I honestly will, it comes from the view of the Trinity. And that is the difference between the Trinity and the Mormon concept of God is the Trinity is eternal. And it always existed, always will exist. It is the essence of the unmoved mover. It's the pure essence, the tohen in Neoplatonism. But in Mormon,
this is the creator, the actual creator.
Yes, the pre-space-time continuum, so to speak, creator. Whatever was before the space-time continuum, yes. that consciousness that existed is God and created the space-time continuum. That idea is, I believe, true. But what Trinitarianism says is that God has always remained that. What Mormonism teaches is that God descends. He descends, or divinity descends into being, the Heavenly Father and Mother. and the Heavenly Father and Mother somehow descend into mortality, where the Father becomes Christ. And Christ descends into hell, where he preaches the gospel, and then he descends below all things to be in and through all things. This descent, which is called a katabasis in Greek, it's one part of the plan of salvation, where Christ experiences a katabasis. And that is necessary so that we can experience an anabasis, that we can go from being created finite beings to having eternal life and becoming infinite beings. So the infinite becomes finite so that the finite becomes infinite. And in the process of doing this kind of U-shaped program, and the bottom of the U is the crucifixion, and it's repeated in the Exodus, it's repeated over and over again, this U-shaped pattern of descent and descent. It is absolutely impossible to prevent. I mean, God does not actually create us. We are all potentialities that existed even before the space-time continuum. We are all potentialities that exist in God, and he liberates us. But he doesn't necessarily know what's going to happen. I mean, he may know a million different possibilities, but he doesn't know how our free will is going to cause the wave function to collapse to a particular reality in our lives. So he's prepared for it, but that doesn't mean he knows or directs what it's going to be. And so his goal, the plan of salvation, is not to give us a bunch of rules to live by. The plan of salvation is for him to eliminate oblivion, so that we can then come to a point where we can experience, we can come to grips with what we were, and we can repent and change and eventually become one with God and the Godhead. That is the message of Mormonism. And so it's impossible to say that God knew ahead of time. His omnipotence does not give him.
Yeah, that would discredit him.
Yeah, that would discredit him. He doesn't know what he is. What he says, I am the keeper of the gate, and I employ no servant there. Well, what gate is he talking about? Well, there's the gate of birth and the gate of death, but there's the gate of suffering. There's the gate of disappointment. There's the gates of despair. There's the gate of suddenly realizing your church leaders are such a bunch of boneheads, and you suddenly have to go someplace where it's safe. These are all gates. And he says, I am the Holy One of Israel, and I employ no servant there. And I believe whether you reach out to Christ in his name, or whether you reach within yourself to find, power within yourself, that I think is a grace, you have to eventually come to terms with living with bad people and negotiating that. How do you deal with it? Well, there's two possible. There's the Via Dolorosa, which is the way to the cross, and the other one is the Via Curiosa, which is the way to power. You either will move toward power so you can control other people. Real religion isn't control. Real religion is abdication of control. And that's why we're here. And, I'm not that good of a theologian that I could answer the question of the problem of pain, which a lot of theologians have attempted to answer. But the way I answer it is to say that, dare we for shame enter the kingdom with ease when our Lord Jesus Christ has entered with so much pain. So I guess God's answer to that is that he himself was afflicted with the same afflictions with which we are afflicted, and even worse.
Okay, so Jack, do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I do. I'd like to share with you, Paul, a concept that I came up with to answer this question. And I want to start with one of Joseph Smith's mystical writings. It says here, man was also in the beginning with God, intelligence or light of truth, was not created or made, neither indeed can be. And you mentioned that our, ability to think and who we are wasn't created by the original creator. And then the next verse says, all truth is independent in that sphere in which God has placed it to act for itself as all intelligence also, otherwise there is no existence. And behold, here lies the agency of man. And you also mentioned that God wouldn't know what we were to do. Now, the problem arises where some God or the original creator must know what all the intelligences would have done. So here's my answer to my own question. Is in Mormonism, we get exalted, and it says God goes to prepare a place for you. Well, in my opinion, God goes, and meaning the grandfather God, not the God of the earth we're on right now, but his God. He goes up to the creator, the original source, and gets some intelligences. And he knows what they're going to do. And then he places it in the kingdom that he's going to have that exalted human in. And that God does not know what those intelligences are going to do. But he is going to take the intelligences and fashion them into spirits, although Smith never taught that, but that's what the Mormon Church is teaching today. And then he can actually legitimately have integrity, acting as a heavenly parent, like parents do when they have a child on earth today. He doesn't know what they're going to choose. And he will bleed from his heart when they make a mistake. So that's the answer I came up to cope with it. And I do agree with you with the leaders are controlling. It's terrible, the patriarchy. But that's my answer. I'd like to know what you think.
Well, I think it's a good answer. I to be honest with you, I don't like my own answers. Dan is saying coherence would be nice. It would be. And that's why in quantum physics, they don't talk about coherence. They talk about decoherence. And so things do not connect. And I don't think we should be looking for connections. I think we have to look, window back and see the whole picture and realize there are a number of potential answers that could work. And these answers are in superposition. And I think
That's like Schrodinger's cat, right?
Yeah, they're in superposition. And I think it depends on who opens the box, whether the cat is alive or not. And the reality is, subjective theology is hateful to people who are historians, because historians want a single book. But instead, theology requires everybody to have their own book, which is pretty much what it says in the Revelation of John, where he has his own book. We all have our own book. There's a lot of chapters that are similar, but we do know Galilean relativity and also Einsteinian relativity. If you're in a different place in the space-time continuum, things will look completely different. Time will move completely differently. Light will travel at a different speed. And so you have to understand that when it comes to theology, that's similar in the sense that a person who grows up in Rose Park or goes to MIT, a person who goes to Massachusetts school in one of those Ivy League schools is going to have a different perspective on America. And these are not going to be easy to connect. And that's how theology is. Our experiences make us see things differently. So in answer to your question, I think I think it's fine. I just wouldn't put a period where there should be an ellipsis.
No, I agree. And, my religious views have evolved, but I'd like to share with you what my religion is today. And
Jack,
I consider myself an independent theist.
Jack?
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack. We got two other calls. Actually, Bill's saying there's no other. Are there no other calls, Bill?
There's none.
Why isn't somebody calling so I can hurry Jack off the show? I mean, that's obviously what I'm trying to do. Well, we're also at 1:40, an hour and 40 minutes. Jack,
All right.
You think we could wrap this up? No. Hang on, but Jack.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just wanted to know if
No, I just want you to take 5 minutes. Is 5 minutes enough for you to wrap this up?
I was wrapping it up right now.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just going to let Paul know that I personally, when someone asks me that question, what's your beliefs? I say I'm an independent theist as opposed to an independent deist. And I actually believe that the creator intervenes in the events on earth or in man's life. I was wondering, what is you said it was very personal, but is there any way you can express what your belief is?
5 minutes, Paul.
I don't know how to address that, to be honest with you. Give me another shot at it. I'm a little bit lost here.
Oh, all right. Well, listen, I really appreciate the
No,
conversation.
I'm not trying to put you off. It's just that I don't quite know how to address the question.
It is strange in that, as you admit that the facts aren't coherent and the myth isn't coherent, and you find value in it nonetheless, I think it makes sense. It would be sort of hard to put a finger on something tangible, because I wonder if maybe it isn't something tangible.
Well, for me, I can answer that part of the question. I mean, for me, but it's so personal. For me, I think Jesus Christ is the supreme being, was the incarnation of the divine supreme being. I just simply believe that. I know it's ridiculous. I know that what it makes me look like to say this as an 80-year-old, practically 80, and I believe this in light of everything. I still do. It's the linchpin of my belief structure. I believe that God came down here to suffer because that's the only way that he could show that he loved us more than he loved his divinity, more than he loved his authority, more than he loved his supremacy, more than he loved his elitism. He had to crash all of those things, and he had to descend below all things so that he showed us that he loved us more than he loved himself. And that makes sense to me. And even though it's anomalous from the point of view of, materialism and physicalism and rational logic, I understand that. Yet it makes sense to me.
Well, I can appreciate that, Paul, because I feel the same way. God does intervene in this world, and I believe in that a lot.
Well, since there's no other calls, if God intervenes, hey, Jack, I've just got to ask both you and Paul and anybody else who might be listening, because that was a question that came to my mind too when Paul was speaking earlier. And since we've no other calls, I may as well ask it. If we believe in a God who intervenes and can intervene in this world and in lives, right? Then doesn't that, even if God doesn't know the future, doesn't that still put him on the hook for not doing something in real time about Stalin or Hitler or any of these other people?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, RFM. I think it, again, calls God's integrity into question. Why is it allowed? Terrible. It's exactly what Paul is talking about. This is a personal issue when you're struggling to understand. It's difficult. And these religions and these leaders paper it over like it's simple, and they want their security and their absolutism. It's BS. It's terrible. It's not so easy. At least the Jews will let you question things like we're doing right now. And I respect that. They let you ask tough questions, and they try to answer it. But in Mormonism, they don't want the questions.
It's true.
Well,
what do you think about that?
The best answer, who? You asked Bill?
No, I was asking you, Paul, what you think about that. If God can intervene, why doesn't he?
That's the greatest mystery that I cope with, is how do I try to understand the Lord's rationale for giving help and withholding help. I do not know, but I do believe two things. I believe that the answer to the question is best expressed by Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, which is a great book by a Holocaust survivor who comes out and writes this extraordinary book that deals with this question. And the second thing is that I believe that
the title?
Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl.
Man's Search for Meaning. All right, I'm going to get that.
Well-known book.
Thank you.
And the other thing is, I would say that what we want is God to end the camps. We want God to destroy Hitler or Goebbels, or at least Magda Goebbels, so she doesn't kill her kids, right? In the bunker at the end. We want God to be the strong man. And that's the one thing that God will not do. And it is because of the power vacuum that is created by the abdication of the Supreme Being that we have a war in heaven and we have continuing wars on earth, which really are an extension of that. And the war in heaven is not just in Christianity, it's in all the major mythologies. There's war, the Titans and the Olympians, and the Norse gods have the same thing. The gods are always fighting. Why? Because there's a power vacuum. Power vacuums are what create wars. The power vacuum created after the French Revolution, there was the Napoleonic Wars, and then he became the strong man. And then when he was overthrown, the restoration of the monarchy, and then you have the street, brigades that in the 1840s and 1830s that we get in Les Miserables. You have constantly people want a strong man, and when they don't get one, there's fights about who's going to take the position of being a strong man. That's happening right now in this country, and God will not be the strong man, and because he's not the strong man, people's horrible fantasies of power and sex and money and privilege and forcing people to give up their lives so for them, the powerful want others to give up their lives for the powerful, which is what slavery is all about. And it doesn't matter whether you own the slaves or whether you rent them like we do in our country. Capitalists rent the people. It's this desire to fill the vacuum and of power and use that power for privilege and for pleasure. And that's what we're up against all the time. You go back to the Sumerians all the way to now. It's over and over again. How does God intervene? I think God intervenes on a quantum level, on an individual level. I think he is the keeper of the gate and employs no servant there, so we do not know subjectively what happens to people when they face that moment of death, whether there's suffering associated with it or not. We don't know. And any attempt we have to know is an attempt to institutionalize and make objective that which must remain subjective.
Those are some inspiring words, Paul. I really like hearing that because that's the truth. I think that's the truth for me. That it's an individual thing. It's not to be controlled by this patriarchy or religion, and they pervert the relationship that you can have with the Creator. And even though we don't know, well, it's a coping mechanism. So anyway, I want to thank you for taking my call, Bill.
Yeah, thank you,
and
John.
RFM. And Paul, I have the highest respect for you. I want you to know that. I have your book in front of me, and on page 154 of Sanctity to Dissent, you wrote, "Even now, the evidence of Zion's sickness proliferates." And I think it's sick because we're not allowed to ask questions. We're not allowed to explore these struggles with a personal relationship with a creator or not having a relationship with a creator. But we're being subjugated into these religions. It's terrible. We're being forced to believe a certain way or think in a box, and it's not helpful. And I think your physics is proving that. It's proving that model is going to be dying. Anyway, I'll let you guys go, and I appreciate you taking my call.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you
Absolutely,
very much.
Jack. Thanks for calling in.
And we do have one more call at this point. So we can take that one if you're okay
I'm
with
sorry, Jack took up all the time.
that. Okay.
I'm kidding. Please. Let's
Okay,
have
this will
a
be the last one. We'll end it after this one. So I believe this is Trevor. Trevor, is that the name?
Yes, it is.
All right, my friend. Welcome to Mormonism Live.
Hi. I just wanted to thank Paul, and I really appreciate how honest you are with your beliefs. I always find it frustrating when religious people go out and say, hey, this is the truth and this is how you need to live. And it just resonated with me when you said you believe that Jesus is your God, and you know that it sounds crazy, but for you, it's what resonates for you. And I wish that more people would do that, because we don't know. And we're all just trying to get through life. Like, I have my own beliefs. I don't know if they're true or not, but I find it comforting for me. And I wish more people would do that. And I love that you're honest about that.
Well, thank you. I've often told myself, I understand perfectly well that Jesus may be a fictional character. I'm not blind to that. I'm a literary man. But I prefer him as a fictional character to be my God than the ones invented by theologians in other places. I mean, I just like him. I'm like Sancho Panza feels about Don Quixote.
I like him.
I like him.
I really like him.
Yes.
Pluck me naked as a scalded chicken. I like him.
I do. I like him. What's not to like?
Thank you.
Okay. Have a great
Thank you, Trevor.
Wow. Well, the title of tonight's show is How Did Mormons Make Jesus Our Elder Brother? But with Paul Toscano here, I think we spent the lion's share of the show talking about why did Mormons make Jesus our elder brother? Yeah,
and I'm glad you let me do that. You did a brilliant job of historical work, I have to say. I was amazed when I found the article, and then I was delighted when I got through reading it. I thought, wow, you covered the waterfront here, and basically you kind of historically supported my position. So I was
Which
very
makes me brilliant by default.
By default.
I've always found the smartest people I know are those that agree with me.
Yes, I found that to be.
Well, Paul, thanks so much for coming on the show tonight. We really appreciate it. And we'll probably, do you have anything that you're working on, anything you want to tell our audience about before we let you go and then close out?
I have nothing that I could tell my audience about, except, my recent novel is Driving Jesus. A lot of these things are expressed there in a kind of comical way, and in my journey across the country with Jesus. But the thing I'd like to say to Bill is, and you too, RFM, is that I would, sometime in the future here, after the first of the year, maybe we could get together and talk about how close religion is to the paranormal that is being discovered by credible scientists. And we should maybe deal with some of these things that Bill is so interested in.
I know Bill would be interested in that.
Why don't you come on RFM, do an episode of Almost Awakened, and we'll have Paul Toscano on, and
we'll just take the show on over to Backyard Professor.
Yeah, that would be good. He's great.
Yes. Inside joke. Okay. So that'd be wonderful. Actually, I do profess an interest. I do talk about smiling and nodding, but I am aware of the light particle and the wave and the observation and the not observation. And I did come up with Schrodinger cat correctly in a sentence.
Yes, you did. There's no question about it.
Okay. So I just want you to know that. So I would find it interesting.
Superposition.
That doesn't mean I believe a word of it. Okay. But I do find it interesting.
Yeah. Hard to believe.
Yes. By definition.
You guys are great. Thank you so much for having me on the show again and putting up with my strange, eccentric beliefs.
Thank you again, Paul, for joining us. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Oh my gosh. Okay. That was just for Paul. I was just saying goodbye to Paul, Bill.
Well, everybody's probably going to drop off here any second. I guess they were watching the closing.
Yes, because we've got the best closing in show business. People hang on to watch that closing. That was actually a test to see how many of you hang on to watch the closing. This is the after credit scene.
There's still 317 people watching. So I think most of them stayed on.
No, I just wanted to say, I was saying bye to Paul. Good night.
Gotcha.
I'm trying to get him off the stage so we can close together.
I got you.
Okay. Yeah, this is a professional show, folks. So anyway, what are we doing? You had something down below. I know you want to talk about.
I was just going to mention a few. Yeah, mention a few of the upcoming things. So we've got Mormonism After Dark this Friday, November 15th. Maybe we can pick up this Schrodinger's cat conversation for part of that. But it is the thing that excites me. By the way, folks, I'm an atheist, but these are things that I think about and read about that are interesting.
I'm an atheist too. I don't believe in Schrodinger's cat either.
No, he's dead. He's dead. If you open the box, he's gone. So there is that. And then we've got a week from tonight.
Yes.
Mormon apologetics against all odds. You won't want to miss this one. This, I think, will be a really fun conversation with RFM and myself on something RFM had a light bulb moment about recently, and him and I have engaged in some really, I think, dynamic conversations around it. So we'll be excited to have that conversation. And then in 2 weeks from tonight, there was a recent article in the Deseret News where Stephen Smoot and another researcher did some work trying to make the argument that Mormonism was not in support of the Nazis and that most German Mormons weren't in support of the Nazis. Actually, by the way, it was 50%. 50% of Germans, members of the church at the time, were Nazis, and half of them weren't, FYI. But we'll have some additional research that sort of points out some of those connections. And so, folks, those are some of the things that are coming up in the near future.
If you can go back to the last one, against all odds, Phil Collins will be singing our opening song for that episode. So you want to tune in for that, folks.
Okay, there it is.
I'm trying to bring him more closer to the present.
Yeah, we'll get our second copyright strike if we do that.
Okay, well, we can sing it.
If you sing it not on key, because if you sing it on key, then it counts.
That's the only way I sing things.
It'll count as a cover song, and we'll still get our second copyright strike. That's all I had. I just wanted to share what we had coming up.
Well, thank you, because I had seen that you had those slides down below, and I knew that you wanted to talk about them.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, we're closing, we're moving off, but we're back again. And now, everybody, thank you so much for watching us tonight on Mormonism Live. It's episode 206. We got 2 more episodes before we're having our 4-year anniversary. So we'll see if we can do something fun and special for that. And thanks again for watching. We'll be here again next week, hopefully with you present for another episode of Mormonism Live. Good night, everybody.